Welcome back, everybody, to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It is Friday afternoon, February 10th, and we're here with Legislative Council to take a first look at language that captures the couple of recommendations from the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Commission report that are in our jurisdictional wheelhouse. So, Tim, welcome, and thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Chair McCarthy. For the record, my name is Tim Devlin, Legislative Counsel. Before you have a committee bill, draft request number 230907. This bill implements the recommendations of the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Commission 2022 report. In brief, this bill requires law enforcement agencies and and constables to adopt the domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy and any future versions of it. The author of this policy, the Vermont Law Enforcement Advisory Board, or LEAD, will be required to update it as well. This bill also adjusts the law enforcement officer misconduct categories to include, one, the issuance of a relief from abuse order, that is a restraining order, as category A conduct, along with felonies and certain misdemeanors. And two, misconduct will include a violation of the domestic violence by law enforcement model policy as category B conduct, along with various types of other gross professional misconduct. These recommendations would be incorporated into Title 20, Chapter 151, which houses the statutes for the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, both police training and misconduct, certification, decertification. We'll start with the first part, one of two parts of the bill here. Breaking across page 2, let's see, this is domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy. Okay, Section 1 amends Title 20 VSA, Section 2365, and the new section header. Oh, actually, let me speak to the section overall quickly. This will require law enforcement agencies and constables who exercise law enforcement authority to adopt the 2010 iteration of the domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy. You can, if you'd like to see exactly what that policy entails, I provide a link to it in the overview that is now posted on the committee's webpage, as well as links to all the statutes I'll be referring to if you'd like to pull them up to get a sense of where in the statutory context these lie, or any exact language as well. I'm happy to go through those as well. Anyways, returning to Section 1 and the language on the page. First change we see is to the title of the section itself, Section 2365, which will now read on line 2, domestic violence training, domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy. It adds a new subsection D, new subdivision 1, starting on page 5, line 5, which starts, on or before July 1st, 2024, every state, county, and municipal law enforcement agency shall adopt the 2010 Domestic Violence Involving Law Enforcement Model Policy issued by the Vermont Law Enforcement Advisory Board. Subdivision 2 is similar but speaks to constables. It reads, on or before July 1st, 2024, every constable who exercises law enforcement authority pursuant to Title 24, Section 1936A, and is certified pursuant to Section 2358 of this title, shall adopt the 2010 Domestic Violence Involving Law Enforcement Model Policy issued by the Vermont Law Enforcement Advisory Board. Section 3 speaks to updates that should be adopted. It reads, starting on line 14, agencies and constables referenced in subdivisions 1 and 2 of the subsection shall adopt any updated domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy issued by Vermont Law Enforcement Advisory Board within 6 months following the issuance. I'll pause there then.
Any questions about the words on the page so far? Really appreciate the overview, Tim, with the links. Super helpful in this case because the thing itself is so discrete, but then it obviously is in a context. So appreciate that.
You're welcome. Section 2 is session law and will require the Vermont Law Enforcement Advisory Board, leave again, to update the domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy by January 1st, 2025. And this is a reflection of the commission's recommendations. All right. And let's see, this breaks across the page, and the new, the session law language reads, beginning at the top of page 3, line 1, subsection A, on or before January 1st, 2025, the Vermont Law Enforcement Advisory Board, after receiving input from interested stakeholders, shall issue an updated domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy. Subsection B gets into what some of the recommended changes should look like. They read as follows. The updated domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy shall, 1, address domestic violence survivors' needs and leverage best practices in awareness, prevention, and investigation of domestic violence. 2, identify existing support offered to any law enforcement agency employee or officer who is experiencing domestic violence. 3, identify new means of supporting law enforcement agency employees or officers who are experiencing domestic violence. 4, develop processes to protect the privacy of agency employees and officers experiencing domestic violence and to maintain confidentiality of any information shared by these individuals. And 5, amend or replace language found in 2010 domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy, section 3.8 membership responsibilities, subsection 4, to require a law enforcement agency employee or officer subject to a relief from abuse order pursuant to Title 15, section 1103, to immediately surrender all service weapons. That concludes that section. I'll pause there.
Any questions from the committee?
Now moving on to the second part of the bill. This, starting at section 3, and again, I apologize, this breaks over the page from the bottom of 3 to 4. Goes right to section 3, which amends Title 20 VSA section 2401, definitions, to include 1, the issuance of a relief from abuse order as category A conduct. Again, relief from abuse order is another, it can generally be thought of as a restraining order in common parlance. And 2, to include a violation of domestic violence, to include a violation of the domestic violence by law enforcement model policy as category B conduct. And again, I'd just like to remind folks that category A is namely felonies and certain misdemeanors. And then category B is contains various types of gross professional misconduct. So having a restraining order issued against you would be a category A violation. Violating the policy would be akin to gross professional misconduct in category B. Language itself, let's see, starting on page 4, and we are in, let's see, section 3 amends Title 20 VSA section 2401 definition section. So much of it is left out, but you can see here, let's see, as used in the subchapter 1, category A conduct means, new subdivision D, issuance of relief from abuse order pursuant to Title 15, section 1103. Then 2, and this is just a slight modification here, which adds, category B conduct means gross professional conduct, misconduct amounting to actions on or off duty or under authority of the state that involve willful failure to comply with the state required policy or substantial deviation from professional conduct as defined by the law enforcement agency's policy, or if not defined by the agency's policy, as defined by council policy, and shall include, skipping down to G has not been changed. I'll just read H, which is added for the purposes of this bill. Subdivision H, a violation of the domestic violence by law enforcement model policy. adopted pursuant to section 2365 of this title. That concludes section 3. I'll pause there.
So we've got relief from abuse orders. Now category A, misconduct with Vermont Criminal Justice Council. That's the highest level, right?
Yes.
And then we're adding a violation of the domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy to category B.
Yes.
So the G is the last thing in the long list of category B.
It is.
And then H is the new one at the bottom. So everybody clear on the construction. So there's this long list of what's category B, and then we get a new H. Okay.
Section 4 amends Title 20, Section 2409, accessibility and confidentiality, and will require the Vermont Criminal Justice Council to collect and annually report aggregate data regarding domestic and sexual violence and complaints of category A and B conduct resulting in the filing of charges or stipulations or the taking of disciplinary action. The words themselves at the top of page 5 begin on line 2, and this adds a new sub division G1 and 2, and reads as follows. The council shall collect aggregate data on the number of A, complaints received that involve domestic or sexual violence, and B, the number of complaints for category A and B conduct that resulted in the filing of charges or stipulations or the taking of disciplinary action. Subdivision 2, the council shall provide a report of the aggregated data collected pursuant to subdivision 1 of the subsection to the House Committee on Judiciary and House Committees on Judiciary and on Government Operations and Military Affairs, and the Senate Committees on Judiciary and on Government Operations annually on or before January 15th. And then we go down to the concluding section 5, the effective date. This bill shall take effect upon passage.
So we would get a report not on the specific instances. We wouldn't see any of the details because everything that we see is public. I'm assuming that in this context, we're talking about aggregated data because other data that the Vermont Criminal Justice Council gets to see, has information about the specific officers in the specific instances of misconduct that wouldn't be appropriate for us. So we're getting the aggregate data. That's
correct.
What the intent is here? Okay. Oh, Representative Higgler.
Yeah, no, I just, when it talks about a report, is that a written report or can that be verbal? I mean, can they come in and give that report or does it have to be written?
That's a great question. I'll have to look at the other statutory language to see exactly how report is used, although we can specify right now if you'd like. We can put in written or we can provide folks the option if we would like to be crystal clear about that here.
Again, I just don't know what would be best. I mean, a lot of times reports go unnoticed for sure. And if we have those folks in at least once a year, we could certainly short and sweet, hopefully.
Yeah, I think the idea was the commission wanted us to be sort of cued to look at this again because it's sort of new for us to specifically call out domestic violence and relief from abuse orders in this exact way. So I think they were trying to, without asking us to do a big study, just at least get the information to cue this back up. So I don't have any problem with it, giving them the option to do it written or in their testimony when they do an update.
As well.
Yeah. Do you want to maybe we'll have the Criminal Justice Council in on this, whether that's Chair Sorrell or the executive or the deputy director in the next week or so. We should probably just put a note that we'll ask them sort of what's the regular reporting cycle and what's the easiest way to just get us this information as part of the I think that in the context of the other work we're going to do with the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, they have a number of recommendations that Tim has been working on helping to draft into a committee bill in a similar fashion where they came to us and said, these are the things that we'd like you to take up this year. So I think we'll be hearing from the Vermont Criminal Justice Council on a pretty regular basis. So they'll have lots of opportunities to offer us this very discrete data on these category A and B
Great.
issues. Yeah. Representative Hanko.
Did you mention at the very outset of this that we would have House Judiciary looking at this bill as well?
Yeah, so there are, you'll recall that when AG Clark was here, there were 2 recommendations that fell in our jurisdiction because they're about, the misconduct issues here in the second couple of sections and the first recommendation that was in our wheelhouse around the model policy recommendation. So model policy and the misconduct pieces were in our jurisdiction. And then their other 2 had to do with juvenile, judicial, sort of criminal code stuff that's just not in our policy wheelhouse. I corresponded with Tim and Ben from Ledge Council and Representative Lalonde, who's the chair of Judiciary, about this. And there's a drafting request in separately for Judiciary, other 2 recommendations. So I think just to keep things discrete and keep the jurisdictional things separate, we'll take a look at these issues that are in our wheelhouse, and then Judiciary will separately look at the 2 recommendations from the report. So we're only looking at our half of the 4 recommendations from the commission here.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that is really good context. Confusing when we have all these different boards, commissions, and then the recommendations fall across 2 committees of jurisdiction. So I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. We aren't leaving off those other 2 recommendations. I believe Representative Lalonde will get to them as well. Great questions. Just looking through to see if there's anything. You might not know this, but a question that occurs to me, Tim, is there anything that as the domestic violence involving law enforcement model policy is adopted or is updated in the future? So right now the 2010 one is the current one. That seems kind of old for a model policy like that. Is there anything that automatically sort of reflects whatever the most current one is, or will we or the future version of ourselves have to go in and say, oh no, it's the new model policy every time?
No, the former. Let's see, where are we? Essentially, law enforcement agencies and constables who practice law enforcement will have 6 months to adopt anything that's any update that's issued by LEAP. And that is, let's see, section 1, the bottom of page 2, at subdivision 3 there.
Okay. So we won't have to come back to this just to update the version of the model policy.
Correct.
Does the language at the bottom of page 3, so the policy revision, we're asking them to adopt as policy that an employee of a law enforcement agency or officer subject to a relief from abuse order, the 15 VSA 1103 is that's what we're talking about, is the relief from abuse order, right? To immediately surrender all service weapons. I'm trying to understand the reference there.
Sure. We wanted to back up the reference of that term as is defined in statute. So the reader may be likely in this, a law enforcement officer or the agency in which they work for, be able to see exactly what the order by just following that citation. So that just really directs the reader to Title 15, where definition of that order and all the surrounding hearings around that are described in detail.
Great. We discussed that with the Attorney General, but we'll have her, somebody from her office back in along with the network. And I'm going to invite some folks from the Law Enforcement Advisory Board to weigh in on this as well. And I think we'll take some testimony on that. And if folks have other ideas of who they might want to hear from, I'm going to start scheduling that for, depending on what week after next looks like. I think that's probably, we'll do like half a day on this and try to move it out. I had thought to wrap this up in the bigger Vermont Criminal Justice Council, but I think that's just trying to sort of pack too much into one bill. I think we'll have this be a discrete thing. And if there's anybody who feels really strongly or excited, especially amongst our new members, that might want to help me dig in on this and report it, that would be really welcome too. So if anybody's particularly interested in being a reporter of this, once we get through some of the testimony, I'd love to sit down and think about who we need to hear from and work on that together. Any other questions for Tim about the words on the page? Great. Well, Tim, thank you. I think you,
You're welcome.
I think you captured what the Attorney General and the Commission were asking us to do very nicely. Yeah, I saw that. Did he respond? All right. Great. So, Tim, you are free. Thank you very much. We're going to have Tucker come in to give us the latest version of H127 shortly here. So while we're waiting for Tucker to join us, we are going to be, the way I'm thinking about next week is that we're going to a bunch of testimony to wrap up, hopefully, and a wrap up if we're ready, our work on H127 initially. And it has stops along the way, as we've discussed. It'll have to go to Ways and Means for them to talk about the revenue sharing and how all of the financial mechanics work on the back end. So we'll look at this new draft when Tucker gets here, and then hopefully look to spend some chunks of next week talking to the operators, hearing more about, we're going to hear a little bit of the expert testimony that we've been asking for. And there were a couple of recommendations that we should discuss around getting witnesses. If there are other folks that we haven't talked about or a voice that we want to hear, happy to make some time for that, because I've blocked out some time for us to work on this and then get it on its way. I'm going to be inviting folks to come in and discuss some more of the elections, miscellaneous elections bill that I put some draft language on the table. There's a number of folks who want to testify about that. So we'll spend some time working on elections issues. And Director Senning has some specific language to add a new section that's about overseas ballot returns that I think will be really helpful and interesting. And there are a couple of folks who will testify on that. So we'll do some elections work. And then we are hopefully going to spend a couple of half days on that OPR bill. And unless I get surprised, we'll get that out. So we basically have like three things kind of moving that are all big. But hopefully we can wrap up our work on sports betting so it doesn't feel like we're hopping around between too many things all at once. So I appreciate everybody's patience. I think the bottleneck is next week where we're so once we get past the sports betting and the OPR, I'd like to focus a little bit on the elections bill after that in the back half of the month. and really dig in on our work on public safety. So there's going to be, I'm anticipating that there's going to be a bill to start to look at how we better support emergency medical services coming our way by then, which I think will be a hot topic for a lot of us that are concerned about some of the issues there. It'll bump up against some of the things we heard about with regional dispatch. And there'll be a dispatch bill coming to us from the Senate. I know Senate Gov.Ops is working really hard to try to come to some model that they can put before us for how to resolve some of these dispatch issues. I anticipate a pretty good chunk of our work after crossover is going to be about public safety, dispatch, EMS, how all these things kind of come together. I don't anticipate that we're going to solve all of these big issues in one year of the session. But a recurring theme this biennium is going to be our work on public safety. So that's kind of my looking into the crystal ball. Yeah, Representative Rowicki.
This morning, we were supposed to hear a presentation about, I think, technology requests with Children's Integrated Services. Is that going to show up next week?
Yes, absolutely. So they're on our sort of, I checked off my digital services box, and you're absolutely right to bring that back up. Our training this morning bumped, and Matt Levin and those who is representing those folks had said it wasn't a huge time priority. Just wanted to make sure we made time. So they're pretty flexible about when we get them in. So we'll try to have them in either next week or the following week when we've got a little time. But that'll be a budget request that's kind of in our information technology jurisdiction scope that's outside of, I think, what the Agency of Digital Services presented to us. So we'll need to dig into that.
So it's, the time constraint is, there's really not a time constraint because it's part of the big bill.
Yeah, it's a policy request to us that's outside of the administration's requests. So that's the why it's important for us to sort of hear that earlier in the process if we want to modify or augment the ADS requests to support some additional work with CIS. Also kind of in the same IT bucket, I haven't lost sight of the budget adjustment request that we kind of parked for the judiciary. And so we'll return to that as we consider the FY24 policy recommendations. And I don't think we've gotten our letter requesting our response yet from the Appropriations Committee. And, we had doled out some of the budget liaisons from the committee, but our esteemed vice chair here and I have, I think, assigned, at least penciled in folks. And I've talked to most of you about either revising your old jurisdictions on being budget liaisons and that kind of thing. So we'll have a lot of work to do. I mean, these are jurisdictions so broad, and there's so many of these things that I'll be relying on many of you to be conduits of information across the hall. And I want to especially thank Representative Chase for, he was in appropriations yesterday hearing ADS testimony. So we'll get a download on that next week. Great. So welcome, Tucker. Thanks for coming. We got through our first presentation early, and welcome, Action. Do you want to come up together, or are you coming up solo, Tucker? So all right, great. Well, we'll direct the committee to, I think the latest and greatest version of H127 is up on our committee page. And when you're ready, Mr. Anderson, please walk us through the latest draft.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. You have in front of you an amendment to H127, specifically draft 1.3 of a committee amendment. It is presented as a strike all. And before you get too scared that your favorite section of this bill has disappeared, I want to note at the outset that I've reorganized the bill to try to have it make a little more sense conceptually of how specifically the bill is organized with respect to the department's duties, operator duties, and then a separate subchapter for the responsible gaming provisions. so that they're no longer mingled throughout the bill with various sections kind of touching on each of those three subjects as we move through. So I've highlighted each of the changes from the underlying bill for you. They are highlighted in yellow, and I'll make stops along the way as we move through so I can point out the specific changes. The first change you'll find on page 1, line 9, and that is that I've added subchapters. And the first subchapter is going to be the authority of the Department of Liquor and Lottery. All right, moving along. The next change, this is a substantive change that I'll flag each time it comes up throughout the bill. It's on page 3. This is within the definitions and specifically the definition of a prohibited sports bettor. And that is that the age to place a sports bet has been raised to 21 from 18. And I've made that change throughout the bill. I'll flag that for you on page 3, line 12. That's the first instance of this change. One of the definitions has also been eliminated, so you'll notice that the subdivision numbers have changed. That was the definition of in-play sports bet. And there was actually no reference throughout the rest of the bill to in-play sports bet, with the exception of this brief mention of in-play betting in another definition. So there was no use for that definition. I took it out since it wasn't used at all in the bill. All right, the next change from the underlying bill, and we are still in definitions, is going to be on page 5, starting on line 7. This is within the definition for what sports wagering is. The new subdivision D within subdivision 16 states that sports wagering does not mean participation in a fantasy sports contest pursuant to subchapter 3 of this chapter. So as I noted last time, fantasy sports contests are currently legal in Vermont. They are at this time separately regulated from what you're all doing sports wagering. And this amendment makes it clear that the sports wagering structure within this chapter and the rules that will eventually be adopted by the Department of Liquor and Lottery won't apply to fantasy sports contests unless you decide that's what's appropriate, something that we'll touch upon later. The next change is subdivision 17. This adds a definition for type of wager. The last time that I walked you through the bill, there's a definition for category of wager, which was the kind of sporting event that's being bet on. And later in the bill, you delegate authority to the Department of Liquor and Lottery to determine whether a category of wager or type of wager can be approved for an operator to offer to the public. It's part of their regulatory authority as new types of wagers are entering the market. It has to get passed through the department first before the public can access it. But there was no definition for type of wager. So I'm here to make it clear that a type of wager means the form of a wager offered by an operator, such as those described in the preceding subdivision, and to run you through those that are described in that clause: single game bets, teaser bets, parlays, over-under bets, moneyline bets, pools, exchange wagering, in-game wagering, in-play bets, proposition bets, and straight bets. But that is not an exhaustive list. Those are just examples in that subdivision. All right, if we're ready to move along, the next change is going to be in section 1302. We're still on page 5, and we're going to be looking at subsection B, specifically the new subdivision B2. It's at the end of the page starting on line 19. The last time you all met, Representative Chase actually flagged an important question about how the competitive bidding process might play out if the department is required to authorize a minimum of 2 operators, but there aren't enough qualified applicants. In the underlying bill, the safeguard was that the department could determine that it was appropriate to authorize a single operator instead of 2. And the question came up, well, what if there's no one who's qualified enough to actually offer sports wagering? Subdivision 2 now states that if the competitive bidding process fails to produce a sufficient number of qualified applicants, the department may And we'll move on to page 6. Decline to authorize any operators to operate a sports book or authorize a single operator to conduct a sports book. So they can determine no one is qualified and we're not going to authorize anyone to offer this service, or they can go with the one operator model if that is what is appropriate.
So Tucker, just a clarifying question, and that they're only allowed to do less than 2 if they don't have enough qualified bidders. But
That
if
is
there
correct.
are at least 2 qualified bidders, 2 is the minimum.
Correct.
Thank you.
And that discretion is in the structure of the competitive bidding process left to the department.
Thank you.
All right, page 6, in subsection C, and we're still in the same overall section dealing with the department's authority. There's an instance on line 6 where 18 has been raised to 21 again. This is concerning age verification measures. In subdivision 2, we have a new criteria for identity verification. The last version that you all saw required the submission of a photo ID. This subdivision, has been updated to require the submission of a photo identification and the review of a supplemental contemporaneous photograph of the person. Most of the mobile applications that you have looked at and that would be subject to this bill require a selfie to be taken. The language built here is a supplemental contemporaneous photograph. If there is other language that might be more specific or palatable that would describe a selfie, but that does not use the term selfie.
I mean, at this stage of the game, can we just put that in as a workable term in statute?
You might define selfie in the definitions section.
I kid.
The only state that has legalized sports wagering to define selfie.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and use my chair's prerogative and my parliamentary experience to say I do not want to put a selfie into a statutory definition. But really, I appreciate you capturing it so eloquently. I don't think there's a better way to do it.
Right.
I'll try to think about that over the weekend while I'm driving around.
Friday, I'm a little punchy, apologies.
Yeah, no. I really appreciate the humor here as we're going through. Okay. So I just wanted to flag that we're next week going to be hearing a presentation by an operator or operators that are going to show us the typical way that this is done, so we actually can see what it's like to sign up for an account and do this kind of verification before we move this bill forward. Yes.
I went onto DraftKings yesterday and attempted to make an account just out of curiosity. And one thing first it rejected my ID, the photo that I submitted, and then had me type all my information in. And then I received an email and they wanted me to submit more photos of my ID and proof of residence from, like, say, a utility bill or something like that. So that would be like another identity verification process, but also location verification. Just from my experience.
Interesting consideration, Representative Chase.
I'm not sure we want to eliminate people traveling to Vermont.
Yeah.
You know, if somebody's here on vacation, students would presumably have location verification, like a utility bill or something, but maybe not if they were in the dorms. But I think people moving around the country shouldn't necessarily preclude them from participating in our.
No, I totally hear what you're saying, Representative Chase. I think because we discussed this a little bit offline, and what I found interesting too, that sort of like stringent process to set up an account is like, that sounds like something that even takes a step sort of beyond this within the operator structure itself as a stuff. And so I just found it like, and I don't know if we necessarily need to do that if it's something the operator is also doing themselves. And I think it'd be an interesting question to pose to the operators when we have them here next week about the intersecting points of what's in statute and what they do within their own platforms that may go above and beyond what we do here.
Yeah, I'm interested to like, especially in regard to Representative Chase's comment, I'm interested to hear from them why would they ask for that? Because if your ID, if you're geolocated and you have a real ID, maybe they're just they might be trying to match information from that utility bill to the ID to make sure that like you are who you say you are, more than establish that you're a resident, because it's your location that really matters, not so much residency, but that might just be about making sure that the ID that you've proffered or that you're sending in is an actual legitimate ID that's really you. Because I think that's part of, from my committee on transportation experience, that's part of the thing when you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, if you have like a license or something from another country, and then you're also trying to prove your residence. But yeah, we should ask the operators about that. Let's put a pin in that for our testimony next week for sure. All right, please continue, Tucker. Thanks for indulging the tangent.
All right, so at the bottom of page 6, we're going to be in subdivision C5 now. We're going to start diving into some of the self-exclusion process and databases. This has updated the underlying voluntary self-exclusion program requirement by requiring it to be a statewide voluntary self-exclusion program, and then to require the department to establish a uniform self-exclusion program that ensures a listed player is excluded from placing wagers with any of the state's authorized sports wagering operators and fantasy sports contest operators. So 2 things to note here. First, this sets up the uniform statewide program so that all of the operators that the state is doing business with within the sports wagering universe will be able to exclude these players based off of a single list. Right? That was one of the things that was discussed when you took a look at responsible gaming last week, I think it was. The second thing that it does is that it incorporates fantasy sports contest operators that even under the underlying bill were not included here. So that was kind of a gap in that even with a statewide exclusion program that applied to sports wagering, an individual on that list would not be excluded from then participating in the fantasy sports contests that are run by effectively the same group of operators. Moving on to page 8. This is at the end of the department's duties. And this is going to be a new concept that has been added in here relating to some of the advertising and responsible gaming / problem gambling protections. It's a duty that is going to be added into the contracting authority of the department. Subsection G, which is on line 5, states that the department shall include in its contract with each operator a provision that prohibits the use of sports wagering advertisements, logos, trademarks, or brands on products that are sold in Vermont and intended primarily for persons under 21 years of age. So this subsection will require the department, as they're going through the competitive bidding process and formalizing the contracts with the operators they're going to do business with, to include in those business agreements that neither party, the state or the operator, are going to sell products in Vermont intended for persons under 21 years of age that have branding on them for the sports wagering operators. So like the logo of the company, as an example.
So we're not going to see, sportsbettingoperator.com t-shirts being sold on college campuses.
I'm not sure that this language would be unambiguous enough to apply to a shirt that could fit someone over 21. But you won't see the sportswagering.com shirt made for babies or onesies or
Bags.
little mittens, maybe.
Representative Cooper.
So we're dwelling on the word intended. Right.
Right.
Aren't we using a more restrictive word? Sort of what we went through with pot. And
What would the more restrictive term be?
shall not.
Shall not? Well, so the intended clause is describing the types of products that are being sold. So this is targeting products that are intended for persons under 21, whatever that descriptor might capture.
It's all kind of vague. To the point of seemingly being unenforceable.
So the idea here is that this is in the section where the department is making it a condition of their contract. So the department, we're telling both the department and the operator as part of the bid process and the contract negotiations, don't market to kids.
Yeah, but we have to enforce that afterwards. Is there something coming up that does that?
It could be enforced through the contract. That would have to go to court, and one of the parties would have to try to bring it up. So that would likely be the department. And you're right that there's some ambiguity here. So the example of can T-shirts that fit adults over 21 be marketed to persons under 21 or even given to persons under 21? Well, the question is going to be, is it a prohibited material that is intended for persons under 21? Even maybe a baby bottle would be ambiguous if perhaps it's not intended for a person under 21. So something to highlight here, if you want to look at some other examples of this, is that this is a provision that's built into Ohio's sports wagering regulations. And I can send you some examples of that if you haven't already seen them. All right, moving on to page 10. And this is built into section 1303. Which governs the procedures that are going to be adopted by the Board of Liquor and Lottery. So these are like the rules, the administrative rules that are going to govern the operation of sports wagering and the relationship between the department and the operators. This is on page 10. So those procedures need to include promotional play requirements under subdivision 7. And those requirements need to require each operator to provide unambiguous notice of the date and time of the promotion or bonus is active and expires, the rules of play, the nature and value of prizes or awards, the eligibility restrictions or limitations for those promotional play, wagering and redemption requirements, including any limitations for either wagering or redemption, eligible events or wagers, cancellation requirements, and the terms and conditions that are full, accurate, concise, transparent, and do not contain misleading information. These are very similar to what would be adopted under house rules, but these are specific to the promotional play credits. And in a moment in subdivisions B through E, we'll get into some more of the procedures around this and what the operators have to do to adopt these specific rules. Right. Subdivision B. We're on page 11 now, line 3. The promotional play requirements adopted by the board must prohibit promotions or bonuses from being described as free or risk-free if those promotions or bonuses require the player to incur any loss or risk the player's own money to use or withdraw winnings from the free wager. So essentially it has to be genuinely free. It can't require the player to submit their own money in order to gain access to it. Subdivision C, prohibit the operator from restricting the player from withdrawing the player's own funds or withdrawing winnings from wagers placed using the player's own funds. Subdivision D, ensure that the promotion or bonus rules shall be available to patrons and the department. And finally, require operators to adopt procedures for the issuance, acceptance, and tracking of promotions or bonuses. So subdivision 7 taken in its entirety, the board is going to have to adopt rules governing each of those criteria for the operators. Transparency, and again, very similar to what's adopted under house rules, but set out very specifically for the promotion and bonus requirements. All right, I'll flag in section 1304, we're still on page 11, that the name of the special fund is changed in the bill from the responsible gaming special fund to the problem gambling special fund. And that for the rest of the bill, as we come across those terms, they're either used together when appropriate or separated when appropriate to make sure that we are appropriately referencing responsible gaming versus problem gambling when necessary. Section 1304 is amended on line 15 to make sure that the proceeds that are set to the general fund are less the amount due to the problem gambling special fund. So the special fund gets paid first, general fund gets paid second. Moving on to page 12, on line 10, I added a new section 1306. So the language here is not new as it applies to fantasy sports contest provisions.
Going back to the component about the special fund, the money will go there first before the general fund. Can that be not withstood?
Yes.
It can.
Always.
Yeah. That's what I thought.
Yeah. So there are a number of states that have amended their constitutions to require gambling proceeds to go to specific funds to make sure that the General Assembly cannot notwithstand. But this is statute, and a future assembly can notwithstand it, suspend it, repeal it, eliminate it entirely. It's the whim of the future assembly to do what they would like with that money.
Yeah, I knew that, pretty much knew that's what you were going to say, but I just wanted to get it on the table for the newer voters to get the really wrap around the notwithstanding component of how we allocate special fund money and whatnot.
It's become, I would say, to add to your comment, Representative Byron, it's almost become taboo to create special funds to a certain extent. I mean, there's a little bit of like a cultural change happening around, saying, this money needs to go to this specific place sort of in perpetuity in statute because, every year, every biennium, there's a new set of people here who may have different funding priorities, but I think in this specific case, the majority of us agree that if we're going to create this legal sports betting market, that we need to put money aside to deal with some of the harm and consequences of the activity. So, but that we can't, unless we change the Constitution, there's just no way to keep a future General Assembly from saying, hey, you know what, we're only doing 200,000, not 500,000 this year to the fund. So
I just wanted to
those of us who are here now will have to bird dog this in the future, most likely during the appropriations process. Thanks, Tucker.
I have a bird dog. It's not always focused. So good luck. So section 1306. By way of explanation, this language already exists for the fantasy sports contest chapter, and it essentially notwithstands the criminal provisions in Title 13 related to wagering and lotteries, so that it's expressly clear that the fantasy sports contests are not a prohibited form of wagering. strictly speaking, it is not legally necessary to include a section like this stating that this is all going to be legal, non-criminal activity, because the rest of the bill is establishing a legal market for this sort of activity to take place. However, because the Title IX Fantasy Sports Contest chapter already included this language, I added this so that it would avoid a future interpretation that there would be a conflict between Title 13 and what is being done here. So this states that the provisions of 13 VSA Chapter 51 relating to gambling and lotteries shall not apply to sports wagering or a fantasy sports contest conducted pursuant to this chapter. And that is some foreshadowing that within this chapter that's being added by this bill, fantasy sports contests are moving from Title IX to Title 31 so that these are all kept in the same chapter of the Vermont statutes annotated. And we'll get to that very soon. All right, within the section on the sports wagering operators and the competitive bidding process, on page 13, all the way at the bottom, line 20, subsection C. Subsection C set out the fees for fantasy sports operators that contract with the department. As you may recall, it was a $275,000 fee. And this language now states, based on questions and comments from the committee the last time you took a look at the underlying draft, that the department shall assess an annual operator fee of $550,000, which shall be apportioned equally among the authorized operators. And the questions that had come up was, are the fees associated with an underlying cost? The answer was yes, but because there was that flat line fee of $275, that means that you had potentially this increase above the potential cost by 3 times what the cost would be, essentially. So this subsection now says that the estimated costs, $550,000, is the amount of the fee, and that it gets apportioned among however many operators are chosen by the department.
So the question I have is, I mean, there's sort of a number of different ways we could go with this. Do we define exactly what the estimated cost is, or do we say that the cost that's adopted in the this is really, there's a chicken and the egg problem here that I can't quite figure out how to resolve, and I know it's probably the tension that you are feeling in trying to draft this.
So the discussion last time really revolved around, well, if there's 2 operators, you've met your minimum amount to actually cover the costs, but what if it's 6? And when I was trying to figure out how to set up the actual schedule of, all right, if it's 2, it's this, if it's 3, it's this, it came to mind, you have a provision in here that says that if there's unqualified applicants, the department can admit 1. And with the language in the underlying bill, that means that they would have, if they admitted 1 operator, half the amount that they would need to cover their costs. Because they'd get $275,000 out of the fee and still have $550,000 of expected costs. So this will ensure that no matter how many they admit, they cover the $550,000. There are other fee structures that could be put in place here as well.
Also,
being fee tables.
Knowing that this is squarely in the realm that our colleagues in Ways and Means think about a lot. I don't know that I'm going to sweat this too much, but
yeah, I mean, I think this is like a good conversation for them to have once they're trying to figure out the operational cost of the.
Yeah, because I mean, our policy intent is make sure the fees cover the operational costs.
Correct.
How we get that in the statute in a clean way.
I mean, ultimately, like the thought process around previous language was if you had a minimum of 2, it covered the operational expense. If you had anything in excess of that, it was extra money that could go to the special fund.
What's tricky about that is we've got rules around making sure that the fees are tied to the operations, isn't it? We've got some guardrails on that, right? We can't.
There are some legal and customary guardrails around that, yes.
Okay.
Understood.
Yeah.
It doesn't always bear out that way, but
yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm definitely out over my skis even saying that. So I might defer to Representative Kornheiser and her crew up in Ways and Means.
I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to capture the spirit of what we're trying to do. And I imagine anything about fees or revenue, they're gonna dig into.
And from like the origin point of the conversation on the like fees, it was to just make sure that the department had its operating budget filled by the license fees, so that achieves this, so.
Well, let's stick with this for now and we'll. It looks good.
All right, yeah, thank you for that thought exercise.
Yeah, that's tough. I appreciate you trying to make the circle and the square fit together.
All right, moving on to page 16. Subchapter 3 contains the fantasy sports contest language that is currently in statute, Title IX, with two notable amendments. The first is that currently the age to play a fantasy sports contest is 18 years old. So for purposes of consistency and parity within your bill, that was raised to 21. If you want to make a different policy decision and keep it at 18, please let me know and I'll change that back. The second alteration to the current fantasy sports contest statutes is that currently fantasy sports contest operators register with the Secretary of State and pay a $5,000 registration fee. This changes it so that they will register with the Department of Liquor and Lottery and pay that $5,000 fee. Now, for purposes of future discussions, the fantasy sports contest operator chapter requirements for both the operators and, for example, responsible gaming, exclusion lists, truth in advertising are all different from what you have done in this bill for sports wagering. And if you want to make policy choices, you can. I just shifted the statutes over for purposes of keeping all of these things in the same chapter of Title 31, rather than having fantasy sports contests lingering out there in Title IX. All right.
So I just want to pause there for the committee and know that conversations with Tucker, Representative Byron, and others made the decision to put before the committee language that made the fantasy sports pieces that are currently legal sort of side by side, but still very much separate from the sports wagering that we've been discussing, which is the new thing on the table. Bringing the age in line seemed to be the right thing to do. But I want to say that that's a distinct policy choice, as Tucker said. So I just want to make sure we're thinking about that as we consider the bill as a whole. Representative Chase.
Regarding effective date for that, would it be appropriate to say the age will increment so that we don't create a situation where a 19-year-old can do a thing today and cannot do a thing tomorrow? So it'd be like, I don't know what the mechanism to do that would be, but like if somebody is already over 18 and allowed to participate, they would continue to be, but new people as they turn 19 cannot or something.
Did we do that with tobacco law?
No,
No, we jumped the.
but we did it probably with drinking alcohol.
I actually don't think we did it because that was a requirement of to get highway funding. So I bet we said,
Okay.
we're not worried about those people who get stuck in the middle. We need to.
New York and when it changed.
I'm assuming that Representative Hango, I don't know that for a fact, but yeah, go ahead.
Do we have any evidence of problem gambling with fantasy sports? And have we heard anything? I know I missed a little bit of testimony the other day, but I was not distinguishing ages or types of problems.
So we in this committee have not gone down the rabbit hole with the fantasy sports, and we can ask some of the operators that we will talk with next week to talk a little bit about who their customers are and what the market is like right now in Vermont with the fantasy sports side. I will say that because we don't have requirements right now in my conversations with legislative council, I don't think we know nearly as much about the fantasy sports betting operations, who's placing the bets, what that or I shouldn't say bets, who is participating in fantasy sports, that we don't really know as much about that as we're envisioning requiring knowing about the sports wagering. So I don't want to completely recreate all the conversations that were happening about fantasy sports in this context, but I want to acknowledge here, and I think what we're going to hear next is my attempt to try to say we probably need to in the future bring these two more in line from a regulatory and an oversight perspective, but I think that's more of a process than we're going to be able to do here in this legislative session. So,
But are we getting, not quite done, but are we getting revenue from fantasy sports?
we're getting $5,000 for each operator,
So that just a fee.
just a fee.
And so why are we so concerned about regulating it in the same way as we want to regulate other types of gaming?
So I want to say we are not in this bill saying that we're regulating it the same way, but in the section that Tucker is about to walk us through, I think we're going to get at asking some questions about it.
Okay, I'll hold off till we read the rest of it.
So we're not bringing, other than the age change, I think, we're not adopting any new fantasy sports
Okay, so the
policy
age
as
change is I think is a big policy decision.
Oh, yeah, I'm highlighting it here. I think it is too, but I also think it would be very odd to have, there are some of these operators who operate sports books and would potentially be bidding that also are fantasy sports operators. And it would be very weird to be able to have an account on one when you're 19, but not on the other. And for purposes of marketing, and I think I'm uncomfortable having these two things exist side by side, and just pretending that they're totally independent when we have a legal sports wagering market, because they're just really not going to be in the minds of many people.
But it already exists today. One is legal, the other isn't. So in my mind, there's like a side thing going on right now. There's legal fantasy sports and there's illegal sports wagering happening. And people are finding ways to do it, even through the established operators that are regulated in other states, right? Because we talked about people going across the border to place bets with operators. So I'm not really seeing how they can't reside side by side. And I don't know anything about fantasy sports, just so you know. I don't have a dog in this game, really. But I'm not sure about making a whole policy shift without taking extensive testimony on why we're doing it.
Representative Byron.
Thank you, Chad. So Chris Curtis from the AG's office, who was a member of the study committee over the summer, fall. It was sort of our like in-house guru on fantasy. He was supposed to give testimony the other day, but had COVID. And we were going to touch on this range and spectrum with him. And he is on the schedule for 2:45 on Tuesday.
Great.
I was going to offer that under the fantasy sports contest statutes, the Attorney General is actually granted rulemaking authority and enforcement authority over that universe of gaming. And to my knowledge, there aren't any rules that have been adopted, but Chris did offer to the Sports Betting Study Committee some information about what the Consumer Protection Division has heard or not heard about fantasy sports contests in their role as the regulator in this space.
More to come on Tuesday.
I will pin what the chair brought up a moment ago, that we are very close to getting to a section that relates directly to this. But before that, unfortunately for you all, I have to cliffhanger that and walk through a few more changes. Starting on page 23 and going through to the bottom of page 25, I added subsection headings to each of the subsections within the responsible gaming and problem gambling section, which is section 1340. In one instance, the Department of Mental Health was added as a recipient of an operator plan, specifically the responsible gaming plan. And you'll note that in a couple instances, as I highlighted earlier, the words "and problem gambling" were added when appropriate. Bottom of page 25, there is the beginning of a few new subsections related to advertising. This is all within the responsible gaming and problem gambling section. So page 25, line 20, advertising restrictions. Sports wagering advertisements shall not. Moving on to page 26. Depict any individual under 21, except live footage or images of athletes in sporting events on which sports wagering is permitted. 2, depict any individual under 21 in any way that may be construed as the underage individual participating in or endorsing sports wagering. Or 3, target individuals under 21 years of age, other individuals who are eligible to participate in sports wagering, individuals with gambling problems, or other vulnerable adults.
This language is very similar to the language that Ohio adopted.
That is correct.
And I thought these were pretty strong advertising restrictions. So I asked Tucker to include them in this draft, but no, we cribbing a little bit from existing law in another state.
I will note for your later reference that if you go back to the existing fantasy sports operator statutes under what is now section 1332, which starts on page 21 and goes through to page 22, there are similar restrictions currently for the depiction of what is termed under those statutes minors, including not advertising in a way that makes it appear that a minor is endorsing the product. All right, subsection F, we're on page 26, line 9. This relates to advertising on Vermont's post-secondary campuses. These are college and university campuses. The subsection states that a post-secondary school located in this state shall not permit sports wagering to be advertised on property belonging to the post-secondary school, except for generally available advertising, including TV, radio, and digital advertising. An operator shall not advertise in a manner that targets the area of a college or university campus. So there are two aspects here. The first is a restriction on Vermont's post-secondary institutions that they cannot use their property to advertise sports wagering. The second is a restriction on targeted advertising for those campuses by an operator.
So this is the operator buying all the rights to all of the panels on the hockey rink, so that we're advertising, specifically on a college campus would be prohibited under this.
Or wrapping the chairs in the football stadium, or buying banner space,
Ticket stubs.
ticket stubs.
Representative Hooper.
The area, college or university, city of Burlington.
A lot of the city of Burlington.
I mean, we have schools all over the place there. How's that in? Enforceability is my question. And whose responsibility it is. Still being able to get plastic straws at McDonald's being the point, but.
Find that throughout my response to whose responsibility will it be, the Department of Liquor and Lottery as essentially the primary sports wagering sports book, who then has these agents, these operators that are offering it through contract.
All right.
And this is another instance where maybe that second sentence could be made more specific to campuses and potentially could be built into the contracting authority so that the department is required to incorporate in its contract specific to advertising, hey, you agent operator that I'm contracting with, you're not going to market on these campuses or buy advertisements on the campuses.
Well, the weird link is maybe that you walk off the campus, you go to a bar controlled by the same entity, and the bathroom is full of download this app, spend all your money. That just struck me as weird.
So I think that the distinction you're making there between a bar and a stadium is a pretty big one. Just in our culture and in
Well, it depends on what our intent is. If our intent is to shield or restrict under 21 people.
Well, if they were under 21, they wouldn't be in a bar.
Eat issue.
Yeah.
Representative Chase.
The potential for like off-campus housing and, mailers that may include campuses, how granular do we want to be on that?
This is the language that Representative Byron and Tucker and I are putting before the committee for discussion. So that's a great question. If you have other suggestions, we're open to them. I think this gets at the spirit of it, and really the enforceability is about, we've got a state operator. We under this bill, we're a control state, right? So we have a lot of control through the Department of Liquor and Lotteries Authority for them to control the behavior of the operators they've given a license to. Now, there's a tension because they're also, tasked with collecting revenue and having the market. So I want to acknowledge the tension that's inherent there, having the dual mission of the liquor and lottery.
Yeah. So if Domino's Pizza sells an advertisement inside the lid of all their boxes and they get delivered on campus, whose responsibility?
Well, there is an exemption that's built in here. It says specifically, except for generally available advertising, including TV, radio, and digital advertising. So the incidental submission of an advertisement inside of a pizza box to a university campus would not violate this subsection. Neither would mass marketing played over, radio. This would, again, prohibit the university from allowing advertisement on its property, and would also prohibit specifically targeted advertising. And again, maybe that term area has to be changed to campus to be more specific, so that the advertisers can't target the campus. It can't be a campaign specific to the University of Vermont, but if there's mailers in the city of Burlington that might be fine. If it incidentally reaches college students.
Folks have suggestions about this, send them my way, Representative Byram's way, Tucker's way. We can take a look at other language. I think I'm happy with knowing the reality of how this will play out. I feel pretty comfortable with this language and don't want to get too granular in what we put in, but I'm also not opposed to being more specific if the committee feels that we want to go there. Knowing that we'll be back on this at least a couple of days next week. Let's keep moving.
All right, the next change is in section 1341, the Problem Gambling Special Fund. The minimum threshold figure has been raised from $250,000 to $500,000. So annually, 2.5% of the revenue, but not less than $500,000 will be contributed to the Problem Gambling Special Fund.
This was a reflection of the testimony that we heard about the very limited investment that's being made in support through DMH for problem gambling as it currently stands with the lottery. So the committee that there was some consensus that we needed this investment to be higher. Whether this is the right amount, I'm not sure. I think it's very related to some of the things that we heard Dr. Klein talk about around the uptake and the stigma around seeking any support or treatment for the mental health issues around problem gambling. So those are all considerations, but I feel better about increasing this amount. Okay. Thanks, Tucker.
Right, the moment that you have all been waiting for over the last 8 minutes, section 2 of the bill. This is brand new. This is session law. This is a requirement for a report. So the Department of Liquor and Lottery, this is the Fantasy Sports Contest Report and Recommendations. Subsection A requires that on or before January 15th of 2024, the department shall submit to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs, hardworking and dedicated, and the Senate Committee on Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs, a report on the current status of fantasy sports contests in Vermont. And subsection B goes into more detail. The report shall include an examination of the number of operators in this space, the amount of players who participate in fantasy sports contests, and the state's compliance, monitoring, and enforcement of the laws governing fantasy sports contests. So essentially, where is the state at right now with fantasy sports contest participation broadly? And second, recommendations for how the current statutes governing fantasy sports contests may be amended to address any issues identified in the department's report. So analyze, examine, flag issues, make recommendations for amended.
Representative.
So why are we changing anything before we get the report? Or why are we proposing to change anything before we get the report?
The only thing
Is age.
is age.
And that's a big policy change in my mind.
It's a big policy change, but again, I will take testimony on this next week.
Okay.
We'll ask the operators. But just thinking about how this works, I don't know if you have the same personal experience that I have with, my uncle, my nephew, both brothers-in-law. When I think about the people who are participating in this, I don't really feel that comfortable with people. From all the testimony we've heard, like right now, information we have about fantasy sports is pretty limited. The regulation we have of fantasy sports is, as Tucker said, we've given authority for the Attorney General to adopt regulations that they have not done. And so we've had, what, 6 or 7 years, Tucker, of legal fantasy sports without, so we've had this period of just the fantasy sports, but not the sports wagering, where it's been pretty much unregulated. And, I'm open to being convinced that we shouldn't change the age, but that one, given the committee's, the testimony we heard and the fact that for all intents and purposes, the fantasy sports participation is putting up money, risking it in a contest. And so, the definition's different. And I understand what the Supreme Court said about it in terms of being a game of skill, but I think a lot of us feel like there's a real similarity between the two things that we can explore next week in testimony. And I'm open to being convinced, but.
I'm not trying to convince anybody because I know nothing about fantasy sports, and I really don't even know anybody who plays them. But my point is, we have taken virtually no testimony on this, but we're proposing to make a policy change of that magnitude. And that in itself is what I'm questioning. I'm not here to convince anybody to change the age to anything. 21 would be fine with me for everything if I had to, be making decisions, but I don't understand how we can change the age on something when we've learned nothing about it yet. So I would be inclined to wait for the report and then roll out a change, because somebody else asked, what is it going to happen tomorrow when you're 19 today and you could play today, but tomorrow you're still 19 in a day and you can't play? I don't know. I don't know how that works. I don't feel that we should have that kind of power per se over, I know we do, but. And the other thing too is, if the Attorney General's office has not chosen to make rules, is that our problem? Why have we not gone after them before and said, why have you not made rules around this? And this is all new to me. Like, if I had known this, maybe I would have asked before, but I didn't know they didn't make rules.
I think you're bringing questions.
Yeah.
That's a great question for when they come in on Tuesday.
Great.
Yeah, we still have, we're not done taking testimony. We're not asking for a vote on this.
Great.
Yeah, these are, we took a lot of information from the committee and various witnesses to build these revisions for all of us to have this conversation right now. And that's what we're doing. We're just noodling on the concepts.
Representative Chase?
The lottery is 18 or 21?
Lottery's 18. So, okay, I really don't want to go back to the conversation. I know it's Friday afternoon and I don't want to say, we could spend a lot of time on the debate and philosophical considerations around when people are at the appropriate age, and it falls on us to pick, to Representative Hanko's point. And it is oftentimes, these are things that are nuanced and shades of gray. There are probably 16-year-olds who are more than capable of making decisions about finance and have very well-developed decision-making. I'm seeing Representative Waters Evans give me a facial expression, maybe not, and there are 25 and 26-year-olds, and there are 38-year-olds who can get themselves in a lot of trouble. So it's that thing of us trying to pick a point, because that's how our laws work. And we'll never get a bill out if we weigh all of these things around the age. So I think we've got to focus our conversations on the specific things in front of us. Having said that, I'm realizing, especially after Representative Hango's comments, we have widened the funnel of the conversation by trying to bring fantasy sports a little bit closer, at least in terms of where the language lives and the considerations of this report to the sports wagering. So well, let's think about this over the weekend and just going to decide that it's 30. No, nobody under 30 should be doing any of this now. Getting a little punchy here.
We are.
All right. So I believe there's one very important piece that Tucker has not quite gotten us through yet. Just the repeal.
So, of course, fantasy sports statutes merging into Title 31 with sports wagering. The repeal section repeals the existing Title 9 provisions.
But all of that language is moved over.
All that language moves over. Yep, the changes that I highlighted are that the section suspending the Title 13 criminal provisions for purposes of this moved out of just being specific to fantasy sports contests and is now broader and includes sports wagering. Everything else is the same except for the change to 21 and moving registration from the Secretary of State's office to the Department of Liquor and Lottery.
Representative Byron reminded me that we had at one point discussed the sort of penalties increasing for violations of some of the provisions, especially around advertising, as potentially being a part of
the 15 line 13.
make sure we.
In the current draft of the amendment, the crimes and penalties section has not changed since that time. One thing that I would note for you as you move forward and potentially have the Attorney General's Director of the Consumer Protection Division in next week is that for purposes of advertising and advertising violations, there are currently provisions within the fantasy contest statutes that define a violation of those advertising statutes as an unfair and deceptive trade practice. Yes, for purposes of 9 BSA section 2453, which I can look up at some point and send you all what those penalty provisions are currently. And maybe that could serve as a basis for, or a launching pad for understanding some of the advertising penalties that you may consider putting in the bill.
Yeah, thank you. So trying to think through that, could we align the advertising requirements that we put in our bill with those provisions or definitions that are in the fantasy sports?
Yes, you could align them. You should certainly hear what they are first, because I just looked up that particular statute and allows the Attorney General to adopt rules governing
So somebody was told to adopt rules and
those provisions, and I did have the Attorney General's rules up just a moment ago, but now I can't get my computer to navigate back
It
to.
seems to me that for an operator that's licensed, the real consequence of violating the rules is the potential loss of your privilege to operate, right? Like that's the real. So maybe this is maybe I'm overthinking it. the end of the week here.
Yeah, no, I think it's a worthy thing to think on over the weekend, right? I mean, sometimes you see financial institutions where like they will actually bring securities law to the benefit of their bottom line, and it's just part of doing business. Make $80 million on a less than moral or legal action, and your fine's $2 million. Just keep doing that all day. So I think it's worthy to have the discussion about at what point does license revocation come into play?
Is that completely unaddressed right now?
Well, we have the penalties and stuff there. We discussed it, and that's what I'm doing.
Okay.
I'm throwing that out on the table for everybody to think about as we like dive into this with more detail next week.
Yeah, it's, do we want to? I think we should put a pin on that.
Yes.
I want to read a little bit more of that section and what some of the other states have done around how they've structured that, especially ones that have had this type of operator model and revenue sharing. So maybe a thing to look at in the next draft. Any other questions about what's in this draft before we wrap up? You know, I'm standing between, that question is standing between us and breaking for the weekend. Is there anything else that we had in the parking lot that, anything you wanted to comment on, Tucker, before we break?
No.
Well, thank you for taking us on that walk through the draft. So we will be back here Tuesday afternoon, so nothing before 4. And I really appreciate everybody's hard work this week. I know we have covered a lot. Next week, similarly, we will be covering a lot. So